Yo, this is Sigjir. We're back again with another drum synthesis video. Today we're going to take a look at snare drums. A lot of this will be very similar in concept to making our kick drums. Instead, this is going to take place over a shorter period of time in a higher space on the frequency spectrum. There's lots of different ways to do this. I think I will probably do a snare part 2, where I will go more in depth into creating the character of a snare drum via layering in real snares or using some other techniques to create overtones and a lot of that middle information. I will touch on that briefly in this video, but the main concept here will be creating that fundamental and the top layer for you to use either entirely as a snare drum in your project or as a starting point to have a clean skeleton to build around. So for those of you that predominantly work in audio, I'd like to attempt to visualize the pieces of a snare and how they sum up into what we call a snare. And it consists of 3 pieces, a fundamental, which is, again, just a sine wave with a pitch mod on it. The body, which is the middle layer. I refer to it as a body. I think this is where a lot of the character is stored, and we will dive into that a little bit in this video, and probably separately as a whole part 2 to drum synthesis, because I think this really could be a video of its own. And finally, our top layer, which is our white noise or some other source of noise to fill out those higher frequencies and kind of add that crisp crack that we need for a snare drum. So if we listen to just our fundamental, you'll hear it's nothing amazing. It is just a sine wave with a pitch mod on it. Let me drag my visualizer in here. So you can see that we have this fundamental kind of hits in this 290 to 300 range, 330 range, with a little bit of the transient kind of popping in around 900 to 1K. Then we have this body layer. I will dive into this more in depth, but this is just some FM synthesis going on with basic waveforms to create some like metallic overtones. And lastly, our white noise. So together, the sum of all of these create this. Now, what makes this work is the timing and the volume or the amplitude of all of these together. So if we get in here and we start kind of shifting things, you'll see that it all starts to fall apart. And so you can hear it's really it's the harmony of all of these things working together at the right times together is what our ears interpret as a snare drum. So let's look at the synth patches and kind of break it down and see what we're doing here. I'll start off by demonstrating this in Serum, and then I'll follow up by demonstrating in Vital and showing you these patches. And then, of course, the samples that we create in this video and the patches will be included for free, which you can get from my Gumroad, and I'll put a link in the description of this video. Let's take a look at our snare here. We're using 3 oscillators. And, we're using all 4 oscillators. And basically what we're doing here is starting with a fundamental on oscillator A. It's just a sine wave with some pitch mod. We then have our middle layer, which you can hear without the FM. It's just this high passed sine sol amalgamation. And then when we FM a sine wave at a higher frequency, you get these metallic overtones. And finally, we have our white noise. So all together, we have a snare. But I'm guessing that you would rather see me build this from scratch. So I will do that. And I will walk you through my steps. We're going to load up a serum and start with the initialized patch. You don't need to. If you have your own initialized patch, you can do that. Work from something else, that's fine too. We're going to start with our oscillator A. We can go to basic shapes and use the sine wave. We can also just initialize the wavetable and add the fundamental frequency and get a sine wave that way. How you do that is up to you. The next thing that we're going to address is this random knob, the random phase knob. We're going to turn it down to 0. We don't want to randomize our phase. It's going to mess a lot of stuff up later on in our mix, and we want these drums to be as clean as possible. Also, that being said, for now, we're going to leave our phase at about the 12 o'clock position, but depending on what we do with these other oscillators, we are going to potentially adjust this phase to basically not have any kind of phase cancellation and ensure that everything remains as loud as it can be. Now, we need to create a transient, which will be a short click sound or a pop. We're going to make sure our attack is all the way at 0 because we need the event to start at 0. And there's two ways to do this. Sometimes I've noticed in Serum, I prefer to do it with pitch mods. Some other synths don't give you a pitch mod that's as reliable, so you can actually shift the phase. And we'll start with the phase shift. I think that'll help. So I'm going to set this to 90 degrees. And you can see, if we're scrolling through our phase, 90 is right about here. And it's slightly, well, no, it's the true peak of the waveform. What happens is if we start at the peak of the waveform, we're not giving ourselves any time to go from silence to volume or to loudness. So by starting right at that loudness, we create a click, which sounds like this. And if you can't hear it, I'll reset the phase so you can hear the difference. So that's one way to get a click. I don't think there's a better or worse way to design a click. It just depends on your workflow and also what you want to do. Maybe you're going to have an insanely complex snare drum that uses all the LFOs, and you don't want to waste an LFO to shape a transient, so you do it by shifting the phase. That is totally up to you. For now, we'll leave the phase at 180, and we will create a transient via LFO. We're going to set this to envelope mode, turn the BPM off, and turn the rate all the way up. Go into the matrix, select LFO 1, go to the global section, and master tune. And then I will turn this all the way up and play around with this, and then we will revisit this later on in the patch and kind of micro adjust and dial this in to work. So for now, we should have a sound like this. You still have that click. Something to avoid are what I like to call laser transients. When you have things too slow or the pitch mod is too aggressive, kind of make these like pew pew, like a laser gun sound. And some people might want that result. Personally, I don't like that, and I try to avoid that at all costs. But an example of that would be something like this. And then if we slow it down even further, So it's really drastic and you can hear it. That's quite a horrible sound. So I should have given you a warning there. But yeah, that's what a laser pew pew laser gun kind of sound happens. So right here we have our click, and the next thing we need, which is really going to define our fundamental, is the pitch mod that's going to be applied to the coarse pitch of oscillator A. So we'll set LFOs 2 to envelope mode, and we will map it to the coarse pitch. You can, if you're on Windows, you can hit Alt-Shift left click on the modulation, and that will change it from unipolar to bipolar. You can also just go into the matrix, and where it says type, I believe the default will be bipolar, which is 2 arrows. Just click on it once, and that should set it to unipolar. The reason why is because we only want the pitch to descend. If we set it to bipolar, it's going to kind of ascend and then descend on our origin point. So we're going to stick with unipolar. So on envelope mode, you can do this with a BPM sync on. I prefer to do this with the BPM sync off. I think it's a little bit easier to map macros to things, because eventually we'll want a snare patch where we can just turn a knob and that will change the speed of it, or maybe the color of the white noise, or things like that. You don't really want to, in my opinion, I don't think you want to make patches for every little thing all the time. It might help at first to practice, but eventually you would like to have a patch where you can kind of like load up snare patch 3 and you can get 100 samples or 100 different variations of snares from your one patch. So you're not constantly rebuilding all the time. Once you know how to make a snare, there's not much that you're going to do that's new. It's kind of just variations and what you need to do in the context of your song or loop or whatever you're doing that requires a snare drum. We have our pitch mod that we're going to create now. And I tend to like this kind of sharp decay and then kind of like a more gradual roll off in pitch. And let's hear how that sounds. Maybe we'll increase it a little bit because it's going to be slightly faster. Okay, that works for me. Something I do want to touch on, I believe I've mentioned this in another video, but I like to use Syscope as a waveform analyzer and Vision's 4X, so I can visualize everything that I'm working on. Yes, you should trust your ears in matters of some things, but some other things you need to be able to look at something to know that it's safe to use or that you're making the right decisions. These are what I use. So if you see me look off to this other monitor over here, I'm looking at what we're doing, along with trying to hear what we're doing to make sure that I'm making a smart decision. So we have our pitch mod, and I'm looking at this. And one of the first things I want to touch on is where your fundamental frequency occurs. There's a couple things you can do when you're making drum fundamentals. You can turn off pitch tracking, which in that case, essentially if you're playing on a MIDI board or a keyboard of some sort, the fundamentals or your frequencies won't change based off of the notes you're playing on the keyboard. You would actually have to tune it via the octaves maybe, and semitones, and then maybe even like fine pitch and coarse pitch if you really wanted to get into that. I prefer not to do that because sometimes I do keep all of my drums in MIDI, and it's nice to just play other notes. Maybe I want a slightly lower snare for just a fill or something like that, and I have that versatility in the patch. So we'll go back and we will leave pitch tracking on. And what I like to do is I tend to keep the fundamental frequency of my snare drum in a higher space than where my kick drum exists. For instance, we are making drum patches in C. I would actually probably do this in the key of the tune I'm working on, but tuning drums is kind of a debated subject, and I think to some extent you can tune your drums, but also you don't necessarily need to perfectly tune them because that's not always what yields the best result. I like to start with tuning in mind, and then I just start adjusting until I get what is right for that given context. For instance, if we're writing like a bass song in C, um, my sub is probably going to exist down in the 30, 32 hertz range, which is kind of just floating around that inaudible threshold. So my snare, for instance, I'll probably keep this around the 260 hertz range. And the reason why is because that is also a C. It's just a lot higher up in the frequency space. And in theory, as even though my kick and my snare aren't playing at the same time, my snare and my bass might play at the same time, and I'm kind of carving out space in this giant puzzle that is the mix. So I'm trying to have as few things compete and clash for attention as possible. So in this case, our fundamental, and also you can go lower. Some of those like 2008 pendulum snare fundamentals are like almost like low mid frequencies. They could kind of be basses on their own, maybe like a pluck or a stab. So there's no rules of your snare fundamental needs to start, up at 290 if you're in C and 300 if you're in D. Doesn't matter. It just depends on what kind of snare character you want, and the rest is all about just making it work in the mix. Ours is starting up in this 290 range, I believe. Sorry, 260. Yep, 267 to be exact. And next thing we're going to do is create a volume envelope for the amplitude of the waveform. Something I will touch on is especially in Serum, I prefer to use these LFOs versus the envelopes. You can use the envelopes. They're just a lot less flexible in terms of like the LFOs. You can draw in these custom shapes. Maybe something like this could be on an envelope. I don't really know how fast these kind of work at like reliably. And again, there's this shape doesn't exist on an envelope, so it's up to you. Workflow and what works best for you is always something to consider. We will do kind of the same thing here. We'll go to envelope mode on LFO3, turn the BPM off. We'll find a rate that works for us, but for now, we're just going to turn oscillator A volume down and map our LFO to this. Now you can kind of hear we're getting to that snare fundamental, but there's still some tonality to it. And for me personally, I like short, tight, snappy, punchy snare drums that really don't express more than they have to. So I would either speed this up or shape this LFO to kind of remove some of that. In this case, we'll try just speeding it up. Okay. And something to note here, now that this exists for the time period, the length that I want it to, we're not getting all the way through our pitch mod now. And if I look at my frequencies here, we're kind of, our fundamentals hitting around a G, which is fine as long as it doesn't clash with anything or create some kind of conflicting harmonics. But in this case, just for keeping things in C, because I might want to resample, bounce this out and resample this, I will tune this down to a C. So, or up, depending on how it sounds. So G would be 7 semitones minus 7 semitones to get to a C, and then plus 5 semitones to get to a C. So we can either go down an octave or up an octave. We can try both and see how it sounds. And we can go up plus 5. For now, I'll stick with the minus 7. +5 can have its place, maybe with a different, maybe a snap or a clap or something, but, or just a real cheeky snare maybe, but for now I want that low body. And we'll kind of just shape this. Okay, so I'm satisfied with that. The next thing we're gonna do is address our top layer. So we're not gonna really work on a mid layer yet, or the body. We're just gonna kind of create the basics, the basic skeleton of what a snare is. So we go to our noise oscillator, we turn it on, and there's a bunch of noises in here. You can use these. I don't think there's a right or wrong noise per se. I have my own white noise samples loaded in here. You can also just drag and drop files into here to load them. The reason why is Serum's default noise samples are all in mono, and my noise samples are things I recorded in stereo. Your snare can have stereo width as long as you're carving out space and you're letting that mono transient get through. You shouldn't really be having issues in the mix later on. If we design everything properly and don't have sounds lingering when they don't need to, or occupying frequencies they don't need to, everything will be okay. We can have stereo width. So turn our volume knob all the way down, and we'll use LFO4. And same deal. We're going to use the envelope mode, turn BPM off, probably end up speeding this up a little bit more, and we're going to start carving out some space. So the first thing I do is I create this gap here where ideally that snare fundamental exists in this gap so that the white noise isn't coming in and conflicting with the transient. So let's map this to the volume, and we'll dial this back in at some point. But for now, let's hear it. Okay. That is we're into the territory of a snare drum now. Obviously, this is not very interesting. So, some things I'd like to address when it comes to working with your white noise and shaping your white noise is the shape of your LFO on the volume of your white noise can create a lot of character, and it can kind of define your drum. For instance, if I'm using this basic kind of down ramp sample, okay, we have a snare drum. Maybe it's a little bit shorter, right? But what we can also do is kind of create like a sawtooth sort of thing here, and all of a sudden we get a different texture or character, right? This is almost like if we ring modded some noise, or maybe we do something like this, right? So we're getting, in a way, different snares or variations of snares just from shaping these LFOs. So I'll play around with this and get something that I like. And finally, I will apply a high pass filter to the noise sample just to make sure. You could do this beforehand. You could process and treat your samples so you know they're going in safe to use. I haven't done that with this. So I will then just kind of try to do a high cut slightly above the fundamentals so that I know I'm carving out those frequencies. And that's a snare. Why don't we copy some MIDI down and take a listen to our loop. And in the context of the whole thing. So of course, that's not a good snare, it's just a snare. What we need to do now is focus on creating a little bit of middle information and then maximizing and getting this thing as dynamic from a sound design perspective as possible. You can use basic waveforms. Something that I quite like is to take something like, let's do another basic shapes. We'll take something like a triangle. I'm going to turn the random all the way down because we don't want that random. And on this triangle, you can hear right now this doesn't really add anything. It kind of ruins our snare. But what we can do is FM. I usually just do a sine wave in Serum. I've noticed everything else can kind of cause problems. Not problems, but will not yield the result that you're looking for necessarily. So for instance, if this is our FM sound, right? The second I go to like saw wave, it just can get lost really quickly. Same with triangle. Square might work. Play around with these, find something you like. Really all we're trying to do is use FM to create metallic overtones. So if I start with the sine, you can hear we don't really have anything. But what happens is if we start actually lowering the octave of oscillator B, we start to get more metallic overtones. Something like this could work. I prefer that sine wave for now, but I would probably revisit and adjust this accordingly for a full tune. So we're going to add another LFO in envelope mode and with the BPM sync turned off to the volume of oscillator B. And this will be similar to our noise where we're going to carve out some space for the fundamental, and then we'll have some kind of a shape here to bring these frequencies in. So let's take a listen. I'll turn our noise off real quick. And I will also add oscillator B to our high pass filter. Yeah, and we're starting to get our character now. So something we could do is get some movement in this filter. Nothing too drastic. This won't work. Right? Kind of getting that pew pew, that laser effect. But if we kind of make this subtle, start getting some movement here. And the other thing we can do, if we carved out our space correctly for our transient, is we can add some unison here, which adds more stereo width. And because we're not letting those lower frequencies become stereo, we're not going to do any harm to our mix in the long run. So something I like to do is maybe use like 2 voices, I think anything, maybe 3. I don't know. Once you start getting into these higher waveforms, sometimes they work. I've noticed it's really easy to fall into like a super trancy kind of, rave stab, super sol territory, and we don't want that necessarily on our drums. Or maybe you do. If it works, it works at the end of the day. So for now, I'll use 2 voices, and I'm actually going to turn detune all the way down, so we don't have any detuning going on. And we'll just take our LFO5 and map this to the detune, and we'll just find a sweet spot. I think that works, and it's something that's really subtle, but it will go a long way. Yeah, I mean, I hear the difference. I don't know if you can hear the difference, but I hear the difference, and it matters. That stereo width can be a good thing. We always hear about leave things in mono. And while we do have to consider that and pay attention to that, technology is getting better and we don't necessarily have to do that. This is more or less our snare. And what we can do is process this with things like distortions, EQs, probably not filters, and I wouldn't do much more in here. I'd probably do more post-processing. But let's take a listen and see if we can get a distortion to work. Something, I mean, you can take something like a tube or a soft clip or a more subtle distortion, and you can map your LFOs that control the oscillators to different things to sort of give it some dynamic distortion. But in this case, I won't do that. Here, I'll put it on tube so you can hear something more drastic. In this case, I think the snare sounds better without the distortion. I think the distortion's taking away from it, so we'll just turn that off. But we will use our EQ. And what we'll do is try to carve out some space where that transient hits. So we'll do something like this. So all we're doing is creating a little peak here, ideally where our fundamental is kind of sitting at. So around this 260, 270 range for us in C. And I'm just mapping an LFO to the gain. So this gain is kind of over a very short period of time spiking up and pushing the transient and then coming back down. Kind of just helps bring that transient through a little bit more. Because if we design these sounds with the intention of working in a full mix at the end, it's a lot easier to make small decisions when you're mixing and mastering, or just doing a final mix down to send your tune off to master. You really don't want to work while not considering what the final product would be, because you'll make all of these decisions and then you'll get to the end and you'll realize that none of those decisions work in the context of the end result. And then you'll have to go back in and correct all this stuff. And it's just a lot easier to avoid that headache when you're just working with the finished product in mind. The other thing we'll do on our serum EQ is maybe just a little high shelf here, and something subtle just to kind of push those high mids and highs. So maybe something like that. And this is all by ear. I wouldn't really say there's any rules of specific frequencies here, or like the golden trick is 561 hertz works every time. It doesn't. It works in the context of this sound at this key or this pitch. You'll have to adjust and experiment when you're doing this on your own. And so what we'll do here is just kind of the same thing, but with different LFOs. So our noise LFO, and maybe even our body LFO. Maybe even a slight mapping to the frequency of the high shelf. We don't want it to be too drastic because, again, we'll get that kind of laser, right? But something like that. And that's our snare in a nutshell. Let's hear it in the context of the beat. I would go back in and tune this this mid layer now. This kind of sounds a little cartoony. So in this case, I will keep this loop running and I'll just work in the context of the loop so I can actually hear what the snare sounds like or should sound like in this beat. Okay. Yeah, so that's a snare designed from scratch. I will show you some of the more complex bonus tips if you want, like macros, for instance. If we check our other serum snare, we have this timbre octave, which is mapped to the octave of our oscillator B, or that FM layer. In this case, it's kind of just changing that middle layer. Because maybe I want a different snare throughout the song, or maybe I'm just sound designing and I want as many options as possible. Something else we can do is create a speed macro, or rate, or time, whatever you want to call it. And we will apply this to, let's apply this to the rate. Turn it all the way up, because what we might want to do is make a shorter snare drum at some point, or a longer one, depending on how you modulate these. But let's take a listen. And I'm basically just applying these same LFOs like we did on our other snare. So we have an LFO for our mid body layer, we have an LFO for the volume and the pitch mod on our fundamental, and then we have our LFO for our volume of our noise layer. And I'm just applying these to the rate of those LFOs. And lastly, our noise. And now you can hear, as we scroll through this macro, the different snares we get. And you can go in and make micro adjustments to all these things to really dial it in and get exactly what you're looking for. It's just a more efficient way, I've noticed, than just building a whole new snare out from scratch every time. So let's take a look at the vital snare. For reference, this is our vital snare. A little bit different in character, but serves the same purpose. We can turn off this middle layer. But you can see we're really doing the same thing. We have a sine wave for our fundamental. We're not randomizing the phase. We have these LFOs set up. This is like our transient, our click. This is our amplitude of the fundamental. This is our body layer here. Let's solo this. Right, so we're doing the same thing, just in a different UI or layout, honestly. Maybe we'll play around that volume real quick. Yeah, so we have that body layer here, and then we have a sine wave doing some FM on the triangle wave. And last we have our sampler oscillator in this case, or our sampler, and this is using some white noise, right? So that's our top crisp layer. And when we put it all together, we get a snare. And this snare works in the context of this beat too. Maybe that mid layer needs to come down a little bit, right? but it works. And it's the same thing, it's just in a different synth. I don't think there's any magic technique that will work for you and say, you can synthesize snare drums, but you can only do this in Serum, or you can only do this in Vital, or you know what, you really need to use Phase Plant or some, snare specific synth, like something like a Seven Deadly Snares. You don't need to use any piece of software or gear specifically to make this. You just need to know the concepts that define what a sound is. And then it's just a matter of, what is the best way to do it in terms of what's most efficient for you and what yields the result that you like the most. So, two bonus tips that I want to touch on, and we'll use our new Serum snare, are dynamic EQ and mid-side control. So I will go ahead and show you dynamic EQ first. You can do this with any dynamic EQ, like a Pro Q, Pro Q4 or 3, or any of the Pro Qs. I think TDR Nova has dynamic options, tone boosters, EQ4 is a free alternative if you're looking for something that does something similar and doesn't cost as much. You can also use your DAW EQ. In this case, I'm using the Bitwig EQ Plus, and you can just add points here and use something like an LFO. In this case, curves is the LFO tool that I'll be using. And I mean, this gets pretty simple, to be honest. It's the same deal. We're just drawing in these LFO shapes like we did in our Serum, right? Maybe we'll want something like that, and we'll have it end a little early. And we'll just try to find pleasing spots for moving frequencies around, but we want to move them only over the course of time that they need to be moved. So usually I'll apply this LFO to the gain, and I'll do something similar to what we did in Serum with the EQ, where I'll put it on the transient and I'll make the transient pop a little bit more. Maybe I want some particular harmonics in the mid-range to pop out a bit more, or a high shelf to bring the noise and make that a little bit more crisp. So we can do that real quick. Maybe we'll narrow this band. We don't need to do much for the transient because we've already done that. We'll find the peak here, and let's go ahead and just add some gain to that. Right, so and maybe we want a high shelf to kind of pull some more of that crispness up in the white noise. We can be pretty subtle with this. Maybe we don't want a lot of that high mid to be there most of the time, and we only want it there kind of on the peak of the sound, right? So and we could probably carve some things out to make more room. Right, so it's making a difference to me. If we can A/B it and kind of hear it with and without, this is with, without. And you have to be careful when you're doing this, because Essentially what we're doing is adding gain to frequencies, and that's making the signal louder. And we tend to interpret something louder as better. So make sure objectively you're working in a way where you're trying to stay relatively unbiased. Without this EQ on, you can see on our meter over here, this sound is about negative 2.4 decibels at its highest peak. It looks like it kind of averages out around negative 12 decibels, but I bet we're probably redlining with this EQ on. Yeah, so we're going into positive, plus 3.1 dB, which is absurdly loud, and you probably wouldn't use something like that in a mix. Something you can do is use a compressor, or, well, I guess they're all compressors, but you could use a limiter or a clipper, like soft clipping or hard clipping of some sort, just to kind of control the true peaks and that perceived loudness. So what I would actually do is let's add a tool here, which is just a utility plugin, and let's just pull like 6 dB off and kind of hear this a little bit more quiet. Okay, cool. So we know, we're in the ballpark. This snare is still here. So that works, Dynamic EQ can really kind of get the sound more lively, moving, but moving only when it needs to move and not all the time. Something else we can take a look at here is mid-side EQ. So similar to our dynamic EQ, what we can do is EQ the side frequencies. In this case, I'm using Bitwig's mid-side split. So I'm just going to be modulating the frequencies on the side. And I will show you a couple other ways to do this. We'll do a high shelf. Right, and why don't we just copy this over here? But instead, what we're going to do, can I not? Okay, we'll just delete this extra curve. Have this. Now, when we're working on this one, we don't want the side frequencies to conflict with the transients that we work so hard to shape. So instead, we will just do that same kind of gap shape. And we'll get to here, right? And then we'll just map this to the gain of this high band. Why don't we go ahead and unsolo the sides. So if you can't hear the difference, I can explain to you what's happening here with stereo imager. Is imagine, I forget what direction is what when it's rotated this way. One of these corners, let's say this corner is left and this is right, for instance. And I'm really sorry if I'm giving you the incorrect information here. I will do my best to go back and research this and correct it if I need to in the description of this video. But if we turn the mid-side split off, you can see we have stereo information in this. If I mono this sound, you'll see it's just a straight vertical line. And we turn the mid-side split on, you should see that kind of abstract shape get wider, right? So without, sorry, we will unmono the sound and leave our gain reduction on. So without any mid, you can see that bright white line. That is our mono transient fundamental getting through. And you can see our stereo field from our white noise is kind of changing ever so slightly. And then the mid-side control really allows us to push those side frequencies without also pushing the mono frequencies at the same time and creating competition. So it's just another way to kind of get more out of your drums without having to like crank up the gain knob on something or saturate the shit out of your sounds. We're getting pretty present snares without doing a lot, which is good because then you can do something at some point if you want, and it doesn't have to be as extreme. If you would like to see this without Bitwig native plugins, I can show you how to do this. Something like a Pro Q3 in this case, but it's the same more or less on all the Pro Qs, which I highly recommend. Really all the FabFilter stuff, but in this case the EQ. It's just a really good mastering quality EQ, and yeah, I can't say enough good things about it. So same deal. We'll have a high shelf here, and we'll find a good spot for it. I like that. Maybe we'll already start off with a little boost in the highs anyways, and we'll just increase the dynamic range. So we're using upward compression to bring in the volume. And then we're going to turn stereo to side mode. Now we're doing the same thing here. We're just boosting side frequencies. Another tool you can use to do this is Pro MV, which works similarly to an EQ. Instead, it's just a multi-band, I guess it's a multi-band compressor. We will go to expand because compress will pull the sound down. We don't want to do that. We want to boost the signal up. Expand, all this knee compression stuff is kind of open to interpretation. And we will set it to side mode. And we'll find a spot where we kind of like what we're hearing. Right, so with, without, and back and forth. So it's really just a good way to get that crisp top layer into the stereo field and sounding full and wide and loud without being super loud and distorted and destroyed. I think that about sums it up in this video for snare synthesis. I hope you find this helpful. If you're following along, I hope you are able to get to the desired snare sounds you are. If not, don't worry. 10,000 hours can make you really good at anything. Ideally, you don't have to spend 10,000 hours, and I hope you get it a lot faster than that. But make a lot of snares. It will definitely help. It will also help you kind of tune your process to your workflow, because maybe some of the things that I'm doing are slowing you down, and you have a way to speed this up and increase your efficiencies, therefore saving time and putting out more music. Do what works for you. I'm just trying to give you the tips that I've developed for myself, what works for me, and take the bits that are good and throw out the bits that are bad for you, right? Or that don't apply to what you're doing. So that brings us to the end of our video. I hope you found this helpful. Again, you can find a link to the presets and the samples we've made in this project file on the description of this video. I do everything on Gumroad. They should be free, or they are free. So there might be a button that says buy, but I don't believe in charging for educational stuff like this. So you can grab those if you're following along, or if you want to reverse engineer, those assets will be there for you. I hope you get a lot of use out of this and you maybe find a way to improve. And if you have any questions about this video, feel free to drop a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Or if you want to see content on other topics, feel free to let me know what you're interested in, and I will try my best to cover that as well. I think our next video will probably be drum tops, and then we'll start moving on from drums, or at least designing drums from there. See you.